158. That is the number of human beings who died aboard the Virginius during a single Atlantic crossing in the spring of 1847. When the ship finally anchored off Grosse Île, the quarantine island in Canada's St. Lawrence River, the medical superintendent who boarded her described what he found in language that would later be read aloud in the British Parliament. The few passengers still able to stand on deck were, in his words, ghastly yellow-looking spectres, unshaven and hollow-cheeked. The first and second officers were dead. 7 of the crew were dead. The master and the steward were dying. Below deck, 106 passengers lay sick with typhus. And in the dark hold, wrapped in sacking and old sailcloth, the bodies of the 158 who had not survived the crossing awaited removal. That ship, the Virginius, carried 476 passengers when it left Liverpool. By the time the quarantine period was over, more than half of them would be dead. And the Virginius was not an exception. It was not even the worst. It was simply one of hundreds of vessels that carried the Irish across the Atlantic during the Great Famine, ships so lethal that they earned a name that has endured for nearly 2 centuries. They were called Coffin ships. But here is what most people do not know. The term coffin ship was not widely used during the famine itself. It appeared only occasionally in Irish newspapers throughout the 1840s. The phrase was popularized more than 2 decades later, in the early 1870s, by an English member of Parliament named Samuel Plimsoll, who used it as part of his campaign for maritime safety reform. Irish nationalists then adopted the term during the land war of the late 1870s and early 1880s, turning it into a weapon of political memory. By then, the ships themselves were long gone, but the dead they carried were not forgotten. And the system that created them, a system built on cheap fares, minimal regulation, landlord evictions, and imperial indifference, deserves to be understood in the specificity that the archives demand. To understand how the coffin ships came to be, you have to understand a piece of legislation called the Passenger Act of 1842. This was the law under which the entire famine exodus took place, and its provisions reveal exactly how much value the British government placed on Irish lives at sea. The act required that the height between decks, the space where emigrants lived and slept during their voyage, had to be at least 4 feet. 4 feet. An adult could not stand upright in steerage. No passenger deck was permitted below the waterline, and lifeboats were compulsory. A stock of medicines had to be carried, but no doctor. The minimum food provision was set at 7 pounds of food per passenger per week, plus 3 quarts of water per day. These were the legal minimums, and many ships did not meet even these. False measures were used. Water was served in gallon jugs that held only 3 quarts. Food was distributed irregularly, sometimes not at all during storms, and the act applied only to British ships. Vessels sailing from non-British ports were not subject to these regulations at all. Now here is the detail that transforms this from a tragedy into an indictment. The regulations governing ships bound for Canada were deliberately looser than those for ships bound for the United States. American ports had imposed stricter standards, higher passenger space requirements, and more expensive entry fees, partly out of genuine concern for public health and partly out of anti-Catholic hostility toward the Irish. The result was that passage to Canada was significantly cheaper than passage to New York. And that price difference was not accidental, it was policy. British landlords who wanted to clear their estates of starving tenants, landlords who calculated that paying for emigration was cheaper than paying poor rates, chose the Canadian route precisely because it was the cheapest option available. The Irish did not choose coffin ships. Coffin ships were chosen for them. The scale of what happened in 1847, the year known as Black 47, is recorded with devastating precision in the official records. According to the data kept by A.C. Buchanan, the Irish-born chief emigration officer in Quebec, 98,000 749 Irish emigrants left for the port of Quebec that year. Of those, 5,293 died at sea. Their bodies were wrapped in whatever material was available: old sails, grain sacks, scraps of canvas, and thrown into the Atlantic. On some vessels, deaths occurred so frequently that the crew stopped performing any ritual at all. The dead were simply dragged to the deck and dropped over the side. Robert White, the pseudonymous author of the 1847 famine ship diary, who sailed as a cabin passenger on the Ajax, recorded seeing a continuous line of boats, each carrying its freight of dead to the burial ground at Grosse Île. Some boats carried several corpses tied up in canvas, so that the stiff, sharp outline of death was easily traceable. The dead were removed from the holds with hooks, he wrote, and stacked like cordwood on the shore. But the dying did not stop when the ships reached land. That is perhaps the cruelest dimension of this history. Grosse Île, the quarantine island where all ships bound for Quebec were required to stop, was catastrophically unprepared. In February 1847, before the first ship of the season arrived, Dr. George Mellis Douglas, the medical superintendent, had warned the Legislative Assembly that the approaching season would bring unprecedented sickness and that the closure of American ports would drive even more destitute Irish to Canadian shores. He requested £3,000 to expand the quarantine facilities. He was given 300, enough to buy 50 extra beds. The hospital on the island had capacity for 150 patients. The first famine ship, the Syria, arrived on May 17th, with ice still an inch thick on the river. Of its 241 passengers, 84 were stricken with fever and 9 had already died on board. Within days, the hospital was overwhelmed. Within a week, 30 more vessels appeared. By May 31st, 40 ships lay anchored off Grosse Île, forming a line that stretched 2 miles down the St. Lawrence River, packed with an estimated 12,500 people. Dr. Douglas reported between 50 and 60 deaths per day. By the end of the month, 900 people had died on the island, and 1,000 more fever cases were housed in hastily erected sheds and tents. The quarantine system, intended to protect Canada from epidemic disease, became instead a mechanism for spreading it. Because the island could not accommodate the flood of sick passengers, Dr. Douglas required the apparently healthy to remain on their ships for 15 days after the sick had been removed. But infection flourished in the confined spaces below deck. People who had boarded healthy contracted typhus while waiting for clearance. The case of the Agnes illustrates this with brutal clarity. The Agnes arrived from Ireland on May 27, 1847, carrying 427 passengers. 16 days later, after the quarantine period, only 150 of those passengers were still alive and healthy. The remainder were dead, dying in the island's hospitals, or sick on board. The quarantine that was supposed to save them had killed them. And then there was the Virginius. Its story is not just a maritime disaster. It is the documented record of what happens when a colonial economic system treats human beings as ballast. The passengers aboard the Virginius were not random emigrants. They were tenants, 1,490 of them in total across 4 ships, evicted from the estate of Major Dennis Mahon in Strokestown, County Roscommon. Mahon had calculated that it was cheaper to ship his tenants to Canada than to continue paying the poor rates their destitution required. He paid for their passage, but he paid for the cheapest passage available. In May 1847, these tenants gathered at the gates of Strokestown Park House and began walking. Their destination was Dublin, 165 kilometers away, along the towpath of the Royal Canal. The journey took 4 days. They slept rough each night along the canal. Research from the National Famine Way documents that they walked past the ticket house that sold passage to Dublin by canal boat, but Mahon had not included this cost in his scheme. They walked past barges carrying porter and whiskey to Dublin, past grain and provisions, en route to breweries and distilleries that continued to thrive during the famine. When they reached Dublin, they were given prepaid passage to Liverpool and from Liverpool to Quebec. The 4 ships they boarded, the Virginius, the Naomi, the John Munn, and the Erin's Queen, were badly fitted out and poorly provisioned. According to Professor Mark McGowan of the University of Toronto, at least 3 of the 4 ships had unsanitary conditions and inadequate supplies. Across all 4 vessels, 1/3 of household heads and 1/4 of all passengers died during the sailing. On the Virginius alone, 158 died at sea. Some had died before the ship even left the dock at Liverpool. After 63 days at sea, the surviving passengers waited another 13 days, anchored in the St. Lawrence, before they could disembark. During that wait, 19 more died. Then, of the 106 who were ill upon arrival, 90 died at the quarantine hospital. In total, well over half the passengers of the Virginius perished. The human details that survive in the archives are precise enough to make abstraction impossible. The Quebec Morning Chronicle published the names of many of the dead on December 24, 1847. Among the Strokestown emigrants who were orphaned on Canadian shores were Patrick Madden, aged 17, and his sister Maria, aged 11, who arrived at the Quebec City orphanage on August 18th, their parents having died during the crossing aboard the Virginius. There was Bridget Egan, aged 6, and her brother Peter, aged 16, from the townland of Kilglass, who were adopted by the Bélanger family of Rimouski. There was Catherine Feeney, aged 18, and her sister Anne, aged 8, from Bumlin. The plight of the Murray family of Gertus was documented with particular detail. 3 generations died: Luke, aged 70, Anne, aged 50, and John, aged 3. On the Naomi, the dead included Patrick Brennan, aged 3, 3 members of the Cox family, Luke Fallon, aged 1, Hannah McDermott, aged 2, and Mary Maguire, aged 3. These are not statistics. These are names. They are ages. They are townlands. They are in the records. Dr. Ciaran Riley of the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, spent years tracing the fate of the missing 1,490. His research, published in Strokestown and the Great Irish Famine, established that of the 1,490 who left Strokestown, over 700 died, buried at sea or on Grosse Île. More than 60 of the Strokestown emigrants were orphaned on Canadian shores and were initially cared for by La Société Charitable des Dames Catholiques de Québec, then adopted through the generosity of the Catholic Church and French-Canadian families. Some of these orphans would later fight in the American Civil War. One, Michael Dufficy, eventually settled in Marin County, California, where by 1904 he was listed as one of the most notable people in the state. He had become a lawyer and justice of the peace. His journey began on foot, walking past canal boats he could not afford, from the gates of a landlord's estate to a ship that was designed to carry timber, not people. The conditions aboard the Coffin ships were described with devastating precision by one man who did not have to endure them, but chose to. In April 1847, Stephen de Vere, an Anglo-Irish landlord from Curragh Chase, County Limerick, boarded an emigrant ship bound for Canada. De Vere could have sailed in a cabin. Instead, he deliberately took passage in steerage, sleeping among his former tenants, eating the same rations, breathing the same air. He wanted to see for himself. His letter, written on November 30th, 1847, from Toronto to Thomas Frederick Elliot, remains the most widely cited first-hand account of the famine voyage. In it, he described hundreds of poor people, men, women, and children of all ages, huddled together without light, without air, wallowing in filth and breathing a fetid atmosphere. He reported that the ship's master never entered the steerage during the entire voyage and would listen to no complaints. The food contractually provided was nominally supplied, but at irregular intervals, using false measures. The gallon measure for water contained only 3 quarts. Once or twice a week, spirits were sold indiscriminately to the passengers. And the ship, with its open fire grates on deck, and passengers secretly using matches and lighted pipes in the sleeping berths, was freighted with government gunpowder for the garrison in Quebec. When Colonial Secretary Earl Grey read De Vere's letter aloud in the House of Lords, it contributed to the passage of the Passenger Act of 1847, which made the worst coffin ship practices technically illegal. The new act slightly improved conditions. Each passenger was now entitled to a bunk measuring 6 feet by 18 inches, though in practice, bunks were 6 feet by 6 feet and shared by 4 people, often total strangers. The bunks were tiered, with little more than a few wooden slats and a thin layer of straw between them. Vomit and other matter from the upper bunk fell on those lying below. But even after the act, enforcement was inconsistent, and the dying continued. The numbers that emerged from 1847, compiled from Buchanan's records, from Dr. Douglas's reports, from the registries of Grosse Île, and from the records of hospitals in Quebec, Montreal, Kingston, and Toronto, tell a story that resists simplification. Of the approximately 90,000 Irish who embarked from ports in the United Kingdom for Canada that year, 5,293 died at sea. 3,452 died at the quarantine station on Grosse Île. 1,041 died at the Quebec Emigrant Hospital. 1,965 died at the Kingston and Toronto Emigrant Hospital. The documented death toll was 15,330. That is 17% of everyone who embarked. 1 in 5 passengers who left for Canada that year was received into a hospital on arrival. And these figures do not include those who died later in the fever sheds of Montreal, where between 3,500 and 6,000 Irish immigrants perished from typhus at a quarantine area called Windmill Point. They do not include the 863 who died in Toronto, where the epidemic killed not only immigrants, but also the first Bishop of Toronto, Michael Power, who contracted typhus while ministering to the sick. They do not include the 1,196 who died at Partridge Island and in St. John, New Brunswick. When all downstream deaths are counted, the toll for 1847 exceeds 20,000 in Canada alone. And here is the comparison that the academic record demands. The mortality rate on Irish emigrant ships bound for Quebec in 1847, approximately 11% at sea and in quarantine according to Buchanan's data, was on par with the mortality rates on slave ships crossing the Middle Passage in the early 1800s. This is not rhetoric. This is a documented statistical equivalence noted by historians, including C&T McMahon, whose 2023 work on coffin ship mortality places the Irish famine voyage in the broader context of maritime death. By the early 19th century, mortality on slave ships had been reduced from over 15% to around 10%. The Irish emigrant rate in 1847 matched or exceeded that figure. The difference, of course, is that enslaved Africans were forced onto ships in chains. The Irish were told they were being given an opportunity. But the mortality was not evenly distributed, and the variation reveals something important about the system. Ships departing from Cork, Ireland's busiest port, in 1847, lost a staggering 18% of their 10,000 emigrants. Ships from Liverpool, through which 27,000 Irish passed, had a mortality rate of over 15%. Yet Limerick, the second busiest emigration port on the island of Ireland, lost only 3% of the 9,174 who emigrated through it. The difference was not the ships. It was the ports. The microbial environment in each port town determined who was already infected before they ever boarded. Liverpool, where Irish emigrants lived in dockside cellars while waiting for their ships, sometimes for weeks, was a breeding ground for typhus. The lice that carried the disease thrived in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of those cellars. By the time passengers boarded, many were already carrying the infection that would kill them and their fellow passengers at sea. The Coffin ship did not create the epidemic. The system that funneled starving, weakened, displaced people through disease-ridden port towns and onto overcrowded, under-regulated vessels created the epidemic. The ship was simply where people died. And while Irish families were dying below deck on ships bound for Canada, other ships were leaving Irish ports loaded with food. This is not a nationalist myth. It is in the customs records. According to Christine Keneally, a leading famine scholar, almost 4,000 vessels carried food from Ireland to the ports of Bristol, Glasgow, Liverpool and London during 1847. While 400,000 Irish men, women and children died of starvation and related diseases. The food was shipped under military guard from the most famine-stricken parts of Ireland: Ballina, Ballyshannon, Bantry, Dingle, Killala, Kilrush, Limerick, Sligo, Tralee and Westport. In the first 9 months of 1847, 56,557 firkins of butter were exported from Ireland to Bristol alone, and 34,852 firkins to Liverpool. Each firkin contained 9 gallons. That amounts to over 800,000 gallons of butter leaving Ireland during 9 months of the worst year of the famine. The coffin ships heading west carried starving Irish. The cargo ships heading east carried Irish food. They passed each other in the Atlantic. The children born at sea during the famine years are among the most poignant records in the archives. The Famine Irish Passenger Record Data File, held at the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, documents 8,075 births at sea among more than 410,000 Irish passengers arriving in New York between January 1846 and December 1851. On the Garrick, which arrived in New York on January 20th, 1848, 33 children were born during the 40-day crossing from Liverpool. 2 of those babies died before the ship reached the dock. Anne Kearney delivered her daughter Bridget somewhere in the Atlantic, in a steerage compartment shared with hundreds of others, without a doctor, in a ship where the dead were being carried past her to be thrown overboard. The peak year for births at sea was 1849, with nearly 2,300 recorded. That so many women in the final weeks or days of pregnancy boarded these ships only reinforces the depth of their desperation. Those who survived the crossing and the quarantine and the fever sheds faced yet another ordeal. The almost 40,000 Irish who arrived in Toronto in 1847 effectively doubled the city's population overnight. Many could barely walk when they arrived. Those who appeared healthy often developed fever within weeks, the disease having lain dormant during the journey. Fever sheds were hastily constructed at King and John Streets, at least 12 of them, each 22 meters long by 7.5 meters wide. The epidemic spread from the immigrants to their Canadian hosts. Doctors, priests, and nuns contracted typhus while caring for the sick. The Grey Nuns of Montreal lost 7 of the 30 who went to help. The survivors convalesced and returned. In Bytown, now Ottawa, Sister Elizabeth Bruyere organized care for the arriving Irish. In community after community along the St. Lawrence, Canadians responded with generosity that the British government had refused to provide. On June 1st, 1847, the Catholic Archbishop of Quebec took the extraordinary step of writing to all Catholic bishops and archbishops in Ireland, asking them to discourage their congregations from emigrating. Despite this, of the 109,000 emigrants who left for British North America that year, almost all were Irish. They came because they had no choice. The potato had failed. The landlords were evicting. The workhouses were full. The public works had been shut down. and the British government, following the laissez-faire principles of Charles Trevelyan at the Treasury, had determined that the market, not the state, should determine who lived and who died. The physical landscape of this history is still visible. On Grosse Île, now a National Historic Site administered by Parks Canada, the western end of the island features a long meadow corrugated by a regular series of ridges. Visitors, who know what they are looking at, recognize the shape immediately. The ridges look exactly like lazy beds, the ridge and trench potato fields that were the agricultural foundation of pre-famine Ireland. But on Grosse Île, these ridges are not agricultural. They are the outlines of mass graves where the dead of 1847 were buried, sometimes 3 coffins deep in long trenches. The same shape that defined Irish life in the fields of Roscommon and Mayo and Galway defined Irish death on an island in the St. Lawrence River. The Celtic cross, erected on Telegraph Hill in 1909 by the Ancient Order of Hibernians, bears an inscription in Irish that translated reads, "Children of the Gael died in their thousands on this island, having fled from the laws of foreign tyrants and an artificial famine in the years 1847 and 1848. God's blessing on them. Let this monument be a token and honor from the Gaels of America. God save Ireland." The cross stands 40 feet high. It uses the phrase artificial famine. That phrase was not chosen carelessly. It was carved in stone. In County Mayo, at the base of Croagh Patrick, the National Famine Memorial depicts a coffin ship with skeletons and bones woven into the rigging. Sculpted by John Bayon, it is Ireland's largest bronze sculpture, unveiled in 1997 by President Mary Robinson to mark the 150th anniversary of Black 47. In Dublin, Rowan Gillespie's departure sculptures stand on the Liffey quayside, gaunt figures frozen in the act of leaving. In Toronto, the same artist's arrival sculptures stand at Ireland Park, near the site of the old fever sheds, depicting the same figures at the end of their journey, barely alive, reaching toward a shore that would become their grave or their home. Between the departure and the arrival, between Dublin and Toronto, lies the Atlantic. And in the Atlantic, unmarked by any monument, lie the remains of more than 5,000 people whose bodies were thrown overboard during the single year of 1847. The Virginius left Liverpool carrying 476 passengers who had been evicted from their homes, walked 165 kilometres to Dublin, crossed the Irish Sea, waited in the cellars of the Liverpool docks, and then spent 63 days at sea in a space 4 feet high, sharing a bunk 6 feet by 6 feet with 3 strangers, eating 7 pounds of food a week when it was provided, drinking water from a jug that held less than it claimed. 158 of them died on that crossing. Their names are in the Quebec Morning Chronicle. Their orphan children were adopted by French-Canadian families in Rimouski and Quebec City. One of those orphans, decades later, would fight in the American Civil War. Another would become a lawyer in California. And on Grosse Île, in the meadow that looks like a potato field, the ridges that mark the mass graves hold the remains of those who were not so lucky, who fled from a famine that was artificial, on ships that were coffins, across an ocean that became a graveyard, toward a shore that had been given £300 to prepare for their arrival. 50 beds. For 100,000 people. 158 died on a single ship. Over 20,000 died in Canada in a single year. And the ships that carried Irish food to England passed the ships that carried Irish bodies to the sea. The archives hold the numbers hold the names hold the ages. Luke Murray, 70. Anne Murray, 50. John Murray, 3. 3 generations of a single family from a single townland, buried in an ocean they never asked to cross.